All right, so we're gonna look at some of our students from Artwod's drawings, and what we're gonna do is we're gonna fix them. We're gonna base this on 3 criteria. 1, is there structure? 2, is the structure believable? And 3, can we better design the structure? All right, it's in this order as well. Now, if you're looking at this and you want to be a draftsman or you want to learn how to draw, you should definitely watch this. However, if you're a painter, you should also watch this, because when you're a painter and you want to make cool paintings, the criteria are also actually the same. However, the wording is different. Is there form present? Do we believe the form based on light and shadow? And can we better design the form? Whether it's color or shadowing or lighting, doesn't matter. That's what you do as a painter. So the criteria are actually general throughout. Now, why should you believe anything of what I'm saying? Well, I've been a professional concept artist in the game and film industry for over 8 years. I've worked in very early stage productions. What that means is that we actually came up with everything that needs to go in the game or pre-production for a film. That essentially means that our art isn't as important in terms of a product like a painting. It's incredibly important as a language to inform everyone else in different departments. 3D team, animation, even audio, based on how we animate our characters and how we portray our characters or environments. So it's an incredibly difficult design job. I've done this for a long time, and I really know what it takes to draw with really good structure, really good believability, and really good design. Now, even if you want to be an illustrator or even if you want to be a painter, knowing this language, knowing this type of fundamental that for me are the most important fundamentals, will tenfold improve your paintings, drawings, illustrations, doesn't matter. Even if you don't end up drawing with a lot of 3-dimensionality, it will serve you so well. When you look at artists that would be considered on the illustrative side, such as Nicholas Cole or Max Grekke, they have seemingly 2D art, but they have a lot of knowledge of the underlying 3D structure. So the knowledge itself will serve you really well. So with that said, what we're going to do is we're going to look at a, let's say, more easy drawing to fix, then we'll do a little bit more complicated, and then we'll end with a more advanced drawing where we can really nitpick on these 3 general topics. So we're going to look at this beautiful study from one of our students. And so we're going to start with the first question. Is structure present? Well, yes and no. Now, this drawing, I know for a fact, is based on an actual reference, right? So it's a replication of a photo or a 3D sculpture. And so what that means is that there was a base to go from and start from. And what I'm judging it by is how well is it executed and what is actually being mindlessly copied and what is actually being understood, right? So of course, being a student of ours, I already see there's a lot of emphasis on trying to find the cylinders in the manipulated form, which is really good. And I think we can take that a step further. So I'm going to look at a couple of things, of features of this Charizard in this case, and we're going to break it apart a little bit. So the thing I see first and foremost, if I compare it to the actual reference, is that some of the things are drawn fairly 2D. So they're just based on what you see in the reference. They're not really based on an understanding of the actual forms that you're looking at. Again, this has to do with construct and then deconstruct. So for instance, the arms, as you've drawn them right now, are fairly 2D. So that means that they're like drawn almost with a silhouette in mind, like this, right? That T line isn't even there. Right, like this, and then something like this. All right, now overall, this is fine, but I'd rather have you create a better understanding of the 3-dimensional form. So for instance, this overlap, I actually already exaggerated it because it's not that hard in your drawing. I want you to be aware of the orientation of that arm in space. So meaning, do I understand the manipulated form of the cylinder that is being projected in space? And do I understand the contour lines going back in space? Same for the other arm, like this, sitting in three-dimensional space. So if we understand this, we much better understand how we need to draw or copy what we're seeing in the reference. The other thing is that the shoulders, for instance, you've drawn them as sort of a cylindrical form. And this means that there's still not that much understanding of anatomy. Of course, that's normal. We need to start with structure and then we can apply anatomy on top, or we can structuralize anatomy, so to speak. So what that means is that a lot of these designs actually, especially Pokemon, sometimes are very much based on anatomy. What they're actually doing is they're creating simplified forms, like, let's say, in this case, like a very simple graphic cylindrical shape for the body, but then they're actually adding fairly anatomical features on top of it, like the legs, for instance, in this case. And I see you really struggle with this. The legs attached to this simplified body are actually very human legs. So the human legs, we have the adductor going into the quadricep, like this. And then we have the quadricep, and the lateral quadricep on the other side, going into the knee. And then we have the quadricep over here, going down like this, and that goes into the calf muscles, basically the soleus and everything else. So this is, what we would see from a typical human leg. And what they're actually doing is they're exaggerating that. So they're not really always basing things on animals, far from it actually, because it humanizes or it anthropomorphizes the animal a lot more if they base it on human anatomy. So for the legs, instead of just mindlessly copying that 2D form, first think about, do I understand how we are combining this form? So we're combining a sphere morphing into another cylinder like this, coming forward, like that. So I'm just going to draw the simple forms in this case, right? Do I understand what's going on here? And do I understand the projections going down like this? And if you do that, if you understand that better, it will become much easier to understand how everything else is positioned in space as well. So again, you want to understand these simple forms. Again, I keep repeating this, and it's for a reason. You want to understand the simple forms first and then the manipulated forms. So again, when I go to redraw the arm, I would just emphasize some of that structure a little bit more. Also keep some overlap in mind, like this. So I'm actually following some of that contour, like that. And I'm creating these T-line overlaps again to show more structural overlap of three-dimensional form before it then goes into the hands. Right, so similar thing for the hands. What I'm seeing, what you did for the claws or the hands in this case seems, again, a little bit 2D. You're just focusing on that outer silhouette and that you're just copying that. But what you actually want to do and what you actually want to understand is that this is one cylinder morphing into another cylinder like this. So these are literally cylinders attached together. So a bigger cylinder onto a smaller cylinder. And then actually there's a tapering cylinder for the nails like this, wedging into that other form. Now, when you're experienced, you can almost suggest this simply by doing a silhouette with a little bit of a T-line overlap, like what I'm doing here. And that comes with experience, but I'm not seeing any of that yet in your drawings because you're still too focused on copying what you see instead of putting on paper what you actually understand from the forms that you see in the reference. You see there's a difference between copying what you see and understanding what you see and drawing that understanding on paper, not the thing you see on paper. All right, it's a big shift in mindset. So for me, the main things you should be aware of is, am I drawing the structure faithfully, right? Even if it looks less like the reference, it's better that you understand, or it's better that you draw with an understanding of the form, because you can always nudge it and change it or redraw it to look more like the reference. But just mindlessly copying it won't get you that much understanding. So focus on that, and then once you understand that, then you can go in and start learning anatomy bit by bit to get a grasp on what simple forms actually make up anatomy and how is that anatomy present in the things that we're seeing, in this case, Charizard or whatever it is, right? And that will skyrocket your understanding of drawing really, really fast. All right, so we'll show the before and after so that you can see that just that tiny little twist in structure understanding also allows me to draw with fewer lines so it doesn't become or look as messy. I just understand the form onto which I'm drawing, and that's the only thing I'm suggesting here. All right, number 2, I'm going to turn this paper around and look at the drawing. So we got a dwarven drawing, love that. So the first question we need to ask is structure present? I would say to some degree, yes. There's definitely an indication of some form here and there. There seems to be a general understanding of the perspective that you're drawing in, which is also really good. Is it believable? Yes and no. Some things really aren't, like for instance, the shackled beard doesn't feel believable. The mohawk seems a little bit two-dimensional compared to everything else. And the dwarf isn't necessarily well designed with shape language, but that goes more into number 3, like, can we better design the structure, right? So is the structure believable? To some degree, can we better design the structure? Definitely. And so this has to do with, I have an example of that here, right? This is for our Dwarven Road that might or might not have been released by the time we launch this, but we'll see. Anyway, it's coming. You can see that when you understand structure, you don't need that many lines, right? You don't need that many lines, but you can definitely create better designed elements with the structure you're using in those designs, in those elements. And this is why I love a good understanding of structure and why I teach it in Artwod to first construct, then deconstruct, and then play with it however you like. As you can see here, when we look at the beard in your case, it's fairly flat, and the shapes themselves are timid. There's no exaggeration, and there's also a little less believability, especially, you know, if we compare the shackles. So the shackles that you have here on the side beard, let's say, they seem like they would just fall off. They would fall straight off. It doesn't seem like they're holding the hair together. Whereas you compare that to what I have here, you can feel that pressure, that pulling of the shape into these shackles and then coming out again, right? It's literally, they're being pressured together, squashed together, right? And then released again. And we want to feel that. So that has to do with believability. And that's something else that is a little bit harder when you're starting out, is to design believable structure. Now, believable structure is actually, to some degree, does it follow, or at least seem to follow, the rules of physics? And this is very important. And the more you start drawing in space with spatial awareness and good construction, you can start adding more weight and believability to the structure that you're drawing. It doesn't only pertain to, you know, beards like this, but it's even how your character holds itself, or does it feel like there's weight or gravity in this structure present, right? And so that starts creating more believability in your designs as well. So that's one thing, right? So we can definitely already fix that. Now another thing would be just the overall shapes, and I'm gonna deal with this. The overall shapes, and this is more with shape language, so can we better design the structure? Now what I'm seeing that you did here for the dwarf is that you designed it based on an actual human structure. So, and I talk about this in the Dwarven Road. I'm hoping it's released by now, otherwise, well, you're gonna have to wait for it, but it's a fantastic little road that we have in the Artwod roadmap that talks about literally this. So if you wanna design a creature and you do it based on a human proportioned face, it's not that it cannot be done, of course, it's been done many, many times. But to some degree, you want to really have some type of shape language, because if I'm starting to draw a dwarf based on a very human feeling, that's not how we associate dwarfs, right? We have to think about the associations we make when we think about dwarfs. We think about blocky shapes, right? We think about blocky shapes. We think about heavy but short stacked, right? This is all shape language. We think about that. And so when we're going to draw a dwarf based on a human face, well, those human faces, or the structure of the human face, isn't short stacked, right? It's just a normal looking face. So even if we add a very big nose to it, and we do it with some degree of realism, but we keep those proportions of the human face, we're gonna lose some of that authenticity, right? Also, it's going to start looking less believable, because now I have this big nose and I need to add a mustache to that, right? And it's like, let's say it's a thicker mustache like you have here. Suddenly that mouth is all the way over here. So it's gonna start looking weird as well. So this is where we need to keep the aesthetics of the structure in mind as well. So if we're gonna draw a dwarven head, well, what we're actually gonna do is we're going to maybe start with that same cranial sphere, but we're going to play with the actual proportions, right? They're gonna change. So the proportions, they're gonna be shorter stacked. So I'm no longer going to have a longer face. I'm going to really, right, and big old ears, I'm going to really exaggerate those shapes. And so when I have this more short stacked, maybe even more squarish, right, to keep, like to keep the shape language in mind, right, squarish like this, squarish jaw, more squarish chin. Right, if I have that as a base, and then I start adding, all right, bigger eyebrows, and then my nose isn't going to be as long as a normal nose would be. I'm going to create a nose that is bigger, yes, but it's also going to be shorter stacked, like this. And then I can draw an exaggerated beard, like this as well. And then the lips, to some degree, still make sense, right? It's still fantastical, of course, but the lips still make sense. And then I can draw, you know, those sideburns, again, keeping some physics in mind, like this. And I can exaggerate the form of the beard, like this. And then we'd have the sideburns on the other side as well, like that. And so you can see that by doing this, we start adding a little bit more believability. And that's it, believability, not realism. We're adding more believability to this design that we're making, because we're not really basing it on a realistic starting point, meaning human proportions. We're playing with shape language to make things look more believable. And this is something you really need to keep in mind when you're drawing fantastical creatures, whether it be elves, we have an elf road as well, whether it be, it doesn't really matter, right? It's orcs, elves, dwarves, goblins, especially in the fantastical realm. This can happen, but also aliens or even anime to some degree, right? We're playing with shape language. And this is something that you have to keep in mind. So one, there is structure present, but it's not as believable as it could be, and it can be better designed. Also, for instance, the placement of your ear is far above the eyebrows. So even though we're playing with the overall structure of the head, right? Even if I draw in profile a square head, and then here, let's say there's the chin. Right? To some degree, I'm still keeping those lumen proportions. I'm still keeping those lumis proportions in mind, and I have a big old nose here, like that, and then eyebrows here, right? That the top of the eyebrows and the bottom of the nose are to some degree still faithful to those proportions of the normal head. And I think that's important because otherwise things might start to look off. It doesn't mean that you cannot play with this. You can definitely play with it, especially if you're a really good designer. But in the beginning, I would just play with the overall structure, change that, but still keep some of the proportions internally correct so that at least the human feeling of it stays believable. I'd say that's the biggest piece of information I give you. And then the mohawk, again, try to make that three-dimensional as well. As you can see what I did here, right? It's just essentially a box in space. So if we have a small box, I put it here actually. If we have a small box in space like this, what are we doing in terms of manipulation? Well, we're tapering it and we're bending it, right? And that's what we're doing. And then we just add texture to it and ta-da, it becomes hair. And that's the power of structure. So if we take your drawing and we look at the before and after, you can see that by applying some of these principles, you can really elevate that design of the drawing. All right, and then lastly is a more advanced drawing, right? This is already pretty good. It's also painted. There's some colors. There's some design to it. So let's start with asking the first question. Is there structure present? Absolutely. Pretty good as well, right? There's some volumes that I can see that work really well. Is the structure believable? To some degree, yes. Again, there's anatomy that we can believe to some extent. Even if it's anthropomorphized, doesn't really matter. It does work to some degree. There's some less believability, especially when it comes to, again, visual weight. And I'll talk about this a little bit later. And then, is the structure well designed? Well, again, design can always improve. We can exaggerate things. Overall, I still like the design. There's a good aspect of big, medium, and small shapes. If you're unfamiliar with it, it's essentially like if we design a shape, we can do it in two ways. We can have literally big, medium, and small within the shape. So that means that, let's say I draw a shape like this, and then this, and this, right? Or let's say this, and that's going to be equal. We can do this, right? So something like this. What we can do within the shape is we can look like, okay, this is a small side, this is, let's say, the medium side, and this is the large side, or big side, sorry. So big, medium, small, right? Same here, we can have, well, this could be medium, and this can be big, right? But we don't want to do medium, medium everywhere, or small, small everywhere, or big, big everywhere. But also a placement of elements would be, all right, if I want to place elements together, I want to do a big one, a small one, and maybe a medium one, right? So medium, big, and small. And this is sort of this concept of big, medium, small that helps us, again, give us a framework, a sort of structure that makes designing things look better overall because we see these things happen in nature as well. We didn't really invent them. Same with the golden rule. It's just something we noticed in nature and we took it as something God-given and put it into art as well so that it looks more natural. And when things look more natural, by default, they look more believable. So what I said about the structure not looking entirely believable definitely has to do with visual weight here. So what we have is maybe two problems, right? When I talked about big, medium, small, there's a bit of a problem of when I just make this character graphic, I can literally simplify him into a big triangle like this, holding something like this, holding an almost equal cylinder or graphically rectangle like this, and then we go into smaller legs like that. Overall, it's fine, but you can either exaggerate the thing he's holding or you can exaggerate him. Now, given the fact that you've given him, I'm not sure if this is a bishop or a salt shaker, but anyway, you could have made that a lot larger to emphasize the strength he has to hold this up, right? Because if you make him a lot larger, the shaker or the bishop is not going to look as impressive. So, in this case, we might opt for making that bigger. But on the other side, when it comes to believability, the way he's standing, and this is something many beginners struggle with when they start doing character design, is that the believability of the stance of their character just isn't present. And usually, it's such a quick, easy fix to do this is just by acting out the pose. So many beginners fail to do this. And take an example from animators. If you see animation in almost any movie, that entire sequence has been acted out by the animator. They've shot it themselves, they acted it out, they shot it on video, they stitched it together, and based on that, they created the animation because they need to add a certain type of believability to the acting of the character. You need to do the same when you want to do your character designs. You need to take this, you need to take whatever you have that is as big as that, right? Either like a rolled up yoga mat or whatever you want to do. You take it, and then you stand like you want the character to stand. And you'll notice really quickly that you will not put your feet together right next to each other like this. Why? Because you'll be off balance easily, especially if this thing is super large and very heavy, you'll just fall over. And that's what your character seems to be doing. They seem to be falling over. And one thing that is very important when you're designing characters and you're designing poses is that you keep all of the axes in mind. For those of you that are not familiar with the axes, and I'll use color for this, is we essentially have, in space, we have a y-axis. So a y-axis going both directions. We have an x-axis. So I'm going to draw this like this. I'm also already going to draw it in perspective. So we have an x-axis like this. And then we have a z-axis going backward in space. So when we draw a plane, on this axis, it goes in depth, right? This is what you see in a 3D program as well. If I draw a box following the y-axis, right, I get a box. Now, when you plant your feet, or when a lot of you plant your characters, you always seem to just do it on the y-axis. You always seem to just place their feet like next to each other. And it drives me absolutely crazy. What you want in level 1 is to at least change the axis to have 1 foot over here and maybe 1 foot over here so that we're also going in depth. Right? So your character, the feet are also standing in depth. So they're not only like standing next to each other, they're like one of them is like coming forward like this. Like this. So there's depth to it. Right? That's crucially important because you will do this yourself. You will do this yourself. When you need to take something as heavy as that, you will put yourself in a certain position to make sure that you can balance it out. And the more you spread out your feet, right, the more surface level you'll cover, so the more balanced you'll be, all right? Now, the other thing would be that you squat through your legs a little bit. So what that means essentially is that your knees or your hips either move in depth in that z-axis. So they either move outward or inward or backward. And this is something that creates an extra type of believability to your character. The other thing when it comes to these axes is that you want characters to cover as many of them as you can to make them look interesting. So instead of having a character that is just, let's say, 2D like this. So if we have a character, right, like this, but that's fine, it's a character, but it's not very interesting. And so number one is that you start creating three-dimensionality to the character. So instead of it being like this, it starts looking more like this, right? And so there's some form to it. But then a next level to that is that it actually has multiple axes that it covers. So it's not only like this, but the character is maybe, I don't know, standing. There's a head here, and then I'm just going to draw a mannequin for this case. His body is like this, and then one leg is out like this, and then the other one is maybe backward like this, and then there's one hand maybe going, right, in this case, in front, and then the other one, right, he's holding a sword or something, is like this, right? And we're covering multiple axes, and we're creating a lot more interest in the character. And by doing so, we not only create more believability, but we also create a more pleasing aesthetic. Now, it doesn't always have to be this incredibly dynamic. It can be. Dynamism creates interest, but it can also be a static pose. But even when you look at my characters, usually when they have static poses, there's still a lot of depth or something going into depth or overlap to create interest in the character overall. Also makes it much better readable, gives it more structure, so that there's no ambiguity over what goes where. And then maybe on a last note, what I want to say about the arm is you have the arm. This is what I was saying about big, medium, small. Your arm is literally medium, 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 right? These are three medium shapes. And we want to avoid that. In order to create some interest, we want, again, to have more of that big, medium, small. So we can have a largely, let's say, exaggerated sort of shoulder like this. And then you can add sort of, you know, a huge bicep to that if you want to. But then you might want to exaggerate that other, you know, I can make the shoulder bigger. You might want to exaggerate the other part of the arm so that you get more of a medium, small, and big shape. It doesn't have to be like this, although this tends to work the best. It looks really weird if you have, let's say, a medium shoulder, a very big bicep, and then an incredibly small lower arm. It just looks weird. So there are some best practices that you can use, but overall I'd say keep that in mind when you're designing a character. And when you do that, when this is fixed, when you have your structure, when it looks believable, and when it is aesthetically pleasing, applying light on top of it and color already will make everything look better. Even if the lighting, the way you're lighting things isn't optimal, it will already look better. And so on a last note, on your case, for this character, the light isn't well designed, meaning that you've taken a light source, and what you're doing is what all beginners tend to do, is they try to be as faithful to the light source as humanly possible. So you're picking a light source, And then you're saying like, oh, because the head is here, the shadow goes here, because the arm is here, the shadow must go there, because the legs are here, shadow must go here. And what you're actually doing is you're creating boring shadow shapes. But again, we're designers, right? We want to make pleasing aesthetics. So those designs also need to be present in the shadow shapes. So you want to create interesting shadow shapes or interesting light shapes, doesn't really matter. You don't want to create confusing light shapes. And that will also help with creating a more pleasing aesthetic for the character. All right, that's just a small side note. I'm not going to go too deep into that yet. First, we're going to fix structure, make that believable, make that aesthetically pleasing. Everything else will then usually fall into place. All right, so if you look at your design before and then after, you can see that we can do a lot with just this piece of information and nothing else. All right, so that's it. I hope that was useful. Keep it in mind next time you start any of your designs or when you're studying, and happy drawing.